Today we're going to be taking a look at paint quality, how brushwork affects our painting, and we'll also be taking a look at the work of William Forsythe, an American Impressionist, and how he used brushwork in his painting. Today we are talking about brushwork and texture and how that works together to create a good paint quality on our painting. And we're also going to look at some of my work in the references I used and talk about that, as well as looking at the work of William Forsythe, an Indiana painter, 1854 to 1935. Take a look at his work and the texture there as well. We're going to start here. It's a reference from Flagstaff, Arizona. Great place to paint, kind of a mini Colorado. A lot of great trails to paint and up in the mountains there. And here I'm looking at a scene where the sun is behind me, which kind of flattens things out. When the sun is directly behind you, it's early in the morning, the light hits everything head on, the barn, the trees, the background hill. So it kind of flattens it a little bit. There's much more variation in value and less flat when the light is coming from the sides. But anyway, this is from the front, and there's a lot going on here. Before I paint it, I want to make some decisions on what I'm going to simplify, what I'm going to eliminate, how much detail I want, and where I want it, and some things I might want to change. Because when I look at this, there's a lack of depth there because the sun is low and just right behind me, so that the background hills are pretty warm. They don't go back, they don't recede as much, and they don't create as much atmosphere. So I want to change that, as well as get rid of some of the trunks and the aspens. Just too many, becomes too cluttered. And I'm going to change the color of the barn as well, just because I want to, and it's, my painting. So here's the painting. Now I did change the barn to a red barn. I thought the real dark reddish orange was just a bit too dark. Added the horse and wagon and the figure there. But I also made the background hill a lot bluer. There's some blue-green, blue-violet in there, and that makes that stay back in the background, creates more atmosphere and depth between the dark pine trees in the middle and the background hill. And also cut down some of the aspen trunks so it's not so busy, that there's some shape in between the trunks that creates a bit more interest compositionally. Also got the shadows lighter, like in the foreground here. The ground, the dead leaves and the dirt and the grass, is very light, so the shadows can't be this dark. A lot of times with a camera, shadows will go way too dark, so they need to be lighter so they fit into the foreground. They don't look like, these look like holes because they're so dark. So getting them lighter will help. I also added more green in the foreground. But anyway, creating a bit more texture with thicker paint. And what I tend to do, we can zoom in and see the thickness of the paint in areas that have more texture to them. Grass has texture, foliage has texture. The trunks don't. The white trunks are a bit more on the smooth side. Same thing with the roof. So things that have more texture are just going to get more color variation, a little more value variation, and thicker paint sometimes as well. So what I tend to do is I will get the drawing on my canvas, and then I'll start blocking in the color. And the block in is just simple dark and light. I've simplified everything to 4 to 8 big masses, and I just fill in a simple dark and light in each of those shapes. And I do it with a lot of thick paint. And that's where I work out the color I want, how much I'm going to mute the color or how strong I'm going to make it, but still keep it very simple. And I apply thick paint right off the bat because thick paint has more of an impact. Thin paint does not have much impact to it. It can look a little dead or kind of dry looking. Now I can start with real thin paint if it's a really large canvas. And as soon as I get the thin paint everywhere, just to make sure the color relationships are going to work, I can go back and then block in the real thick paint. So you can sneak up on it a little bit, but I want to get a block in of real thick paint. Then with a large palette knife, I just scrape it. At the end of the day, when everything is covered, I'll scrape it down. The nice thing about oil paint, when you scrape it, you're still left with the drawing. The drawing's all still there. The values are there and the color's still there. What I've just taken off is the excess paint. And I'll let that dry. Sometimes it can dry overnight, depending on the season. Sometimes it takes a few days to dry. But when that real thin paint dries, again, the drawing and values and color are still there, I can repaint it a lot quicker and a lot more accurately because everything's there. I just need to focus on paint quality, how I'm going to apply the paint. You know, thick paint, a little thinner. Am I going to scrub it? Am I going to follow the direction of the form? You know, a lot of variations of applying brushwork or brush strokes. But the paint quality is better when I can focus on that a little bit more. Now, the opposite of that is to paint wet into wet and then just finish the painting. The problem, at least for me, when I do that is so much paint buildup, it's hard to keep your colors clean and your values accurate because it just blends together too much. But I can fill it in big, simple shapes, simple values, thick paint, scrape it, let it dry, and I can concentrate a lot more on the brushwork because the value and color is already there. This one is a scene or some cliffs in Capitol Reef in southern Utah. And here it's a cloudy day. A little bit of sunlight on the top of the cliffs, sunlight in the sky and the clouds. But it's a cloudy day. There's not much value contrast between this slanted hill in front and the upright cliff. They're too close in value. Now there's a lot of contrast with the dark tree in the cliff. So I like that. I like that strong contrast. But I want to darken this foreground to create more contrast between the ground or the slightly slanted foreground and the upright cliff. They're two different planes, so I don't want them too close to the same value. I also want to create a bit more drama. Not that there's anything wrong with a cloudy day. I paint a lot of cloudy days. But I think it would be more interesting to have a little streak of sunlight cutting through and hitting the cliff and a little bit on the ground and the trees. Now to take this photograph and make it totally sunlit, I think would be a little harder. It'd be like painting from memory, but just to interject a little bit of sunlight works a little better. So if we turn to the painting, zoom back out, here's the painting. Now I've added figure on a horse with some sheep, but here's the streak of sunlight on the grass, a couple of places on the grass. Ignoring the sheep and the figure and the horse for now. Sunlight on the grass, a little strip of it, a little strip of sunlight on the trees and on the edge of the cliffs. I think it shows the form on both the trees and the cliffs a little more, plus a bit more drama with the strong value contrast. Then adding the horse and rider and the sheep. And the sheep are pretty much, I treated them as a solid mass, not individual sheep at first. So this whole shape here, I mean, there's a couple of the sheep that are individual, but I blocked them in just one shape and value, then started adding the darker accents. But I don't render the sheep. There's no eyes and nose and mouth or feet or even legs. It's just a simple dark and light shape, probably three values, a dark and a light and a halftone. There is one head there. But that reads as sheep, and I can treat it as a bigger mass instead of a bunch of individual. Here I've got an individual sheep. But I blocked this in very thick, and by very thick I don't mean palette knife, just mixed up the paint and put it down. I didn't try and paint thin. Again, you can put the paint on real thin first, but get it real thick, very simple, and then scrape it. I don't do that all the time. Sometimes I will block the big shapes in with thin paint and then just gradually build up the lights. But I do like putting the paint down thick first in the block in and get the color relations right, then scrape it and come back in. So you can see I scraped it and came back with this real thick light yellow green. Got about 3 values of green, yellow green. There's some green there in kind of the middle value or middle tone color. But I put this on, it's wet paint on dry paint, so it's more dry brush. You can see how it kind of skips along and creates some texture. Same thing in here, I can kind of drag this lighter shadow into the drier dark shadow. So I repaint both the darks and the lights, but I let some of the dry paint from the initial block in show through and have a lot of dry brush in there. You can see the real thick paint after scraping it, real thick paint in the lights behind the tree. And some of this is scraped paint in the shadow, scrubbed in a little bit of color, but the thicker paint goes in the light area. Here's some dry brush of a lighter shadow on this tree here. That just shows the texture a bit better. So I find it a lot easier, the same thing here, that dry brush, dragging the green on top of the cliff a little bit. Because the cliff is already dry, I've put it in thick, scraped it, let it dry, and then painted on top of it. And it just gives me better paint quality. Same thing with the figure here. Put it in, very simple, and then scraped it and came back and repainted a little thicker. I got more detail on her with the spots of color on the saddle or the blanket and so on. But John Carlson talks about this paint quality. I think it's the last chapter in his book, John Carlson's Guide to Landscape Painting, where he talks about putting the paint on thick, then scraping it. And I don't think it's something he did all the time, but scraping it. And he usually scraped it, I think, when it dried. He used a grapefruit knife, and which is real sharp, and scraped off the excess paint. Then came back and painted into it to get a different paint quality. That looks a lot different than painting everything wet into wet. Kind of hard to describe until you just do it several times. Here's another one. Again, block this in, just the big shapes, 4 to 6 or 8 big shapes. Simple dark and light on each big shape, scraped it, and then came back and added the paint. Again, getting thicker in the light areas and keeping the darks a little bit thinner. But the block in had this kind of middle value orange for the sunlight, and then violet and orange in the shadow. Then after I scraped it, I came back with thick paint. You can see the brush strokes. I don't have to brush away brush strokes. I like the brush strokes showing down here in kind of the foothills of the cliff, just pulling one stroke and color into another one. Some of it's into dry paint, some of it's into wet paint. But it just allows me to get a little different or better paint quality when I paint on top of it when it's dry. And once again, everything is still there when I scrape the block in. The drawing is there, not all the details, but the big shapes, the color, the value, and then it's much easier just to repaint. And you can be much more accurate with the color because the values are dry and you don't have to try and figure out the values. Now here's a barn, I think it's in southern Colorado. Late in the afternoon, the sun's coming from the right. So a lot of details in the barn here on the wood, although in this case, I like that and I wanted to try and render that. I don't do a lot of tiny detail like that, but I do like how that looks against the detail of the tree and simplify the background and the foreground a little bit. It didn't change much here, but I did add horses. And zooming in, I did the same thing with this. I put it in very thick, big, simple values, not a lot of broken color and no detail. And then scraped. You can do some detail and scrape it. The detail will still be there, but the paint will be thinner and it'll be dry and you can repaint much more accurately and a lot quicker as well. So a lot of dry brush on the shadow side of the barn where I'm dragging 3 or 4 different colors into this kind of muted violet and 3 or 4 different values as well to show or to suggest the slats of wood. Same thing with the tree here, scraping it and applying the lights on the foliage a lot thicker. Again, all this, the drawing was there, but scraped thin and dry and able to apply the paint. And I focused a lot more on the tree, so there's more detail on the tree and less detail in other areas. And even the horse, getting the drawing down, simple values down, scraping it, and then going back and painting into it. It just made it a lot easier. Now let's take a look at paintings by William Forsythe. Again, he's a painter from Indiana, 1855 or 54 to 1935. And he was part of the Hoosier group, the Indiana plein air painting group. Of course, they painted in studio too. And most of them went to the Munich Academy in Germany to study. They came back with a real dark palette, very high value contrast, but very muted palette. But all of them eventually became more impressionistic and a very primary, pure palette as opposed to the black and brown that they used in Munich. Now, this is a self-portrait and very confident brush strokes. Some of it's dry brush. You can see kind of dry brush on here. Some of it's wet into wet, but using both to show the texture, show a variety of brushwork, and just better paint quality. Now, this is not oil, this is a gouache. He did watercolor as well. Looks like just gouache on like a gray stock paper board, which is really great to paint gouache on. It's that darker background allows the color to stand out, and worked out color studies with gouache, or just did outdoor paintings in gouache. Very simple, but very nice color harmony. I don't have any of his earlier paintings, which are very dark and heavy, very high contrast. It's more of his lighter palette. Again, a lot of thicker paint in the lights, like on the dappled light on the ground, some of the lights in the middle ground, greens, shadows a bit thinner. But you can see here the build up the paint. I don't know if he scraped it, but really pushing the background trees, middle ground trees, a lot bluer and a lot lighter value-wise, and the values kind of up front. And that's what pulls them forward, is these real dark accents that pull the bush in front of the background trees. Now the lights on the bush are very light and almost kind of cool. It's a cool green color, but there's still more contrast. There's more detail in front, a little more contrast. So it does stay forward. So you can paint something cool in the foreground and have it still come forward if you get more detail. There's much more detail in the foreground than in the middle ground or the background. So more detail pulls things forward, stronger contrast, or darker darks pulls things forward, and then warmer colors can also pull things forward. So although this light bluish green bush in front is cool, it's still warmer than the blue shadows and the greens in the background. So it's going to come forward, plus the detail. It's a really nice painting. You can see how the green in front is more towards the yellow-green. Greens in the background are more towards the bluish green. And that contrast of warm and cool creates a lot of depth. So another one of his, again, midday, things are kind of flat, but pushing more of a grayish violet in the background, a little busier and warmer in the foreground. Nice simplicity in the trees. Looks like a lot of dry brush with some of the foliage. Wet paint on dry paint, letting it set up a little bit, indoor scraping it and letting it set up and go back in and paint over it. It's another one, not a great file, but I like the busyness of the flowers up front. The middle ground trees kept a lot more simple. And again, you can build that up gradually, but putting things in big and simple, a little thicker first, and then scraping them, then repainting, I think you can organize your thoughts and have cleaner color and pay more attention to brushwork than trying to do everything all in the block in. It's a nice one here. I like the composition, the way he's used a lot of negative space in the trees to suggest the trees, the different trees, plus the variety of color. They're green trees, but a lot of different greens in there, from yellow green, orange green, red green, blue green, gray green, stronger green. So ton of greens, ton of color in the foreground too, but all real close to the same value except a little dark accents. So it's a nice painting. A lot of nice texture in the lights. Shadows maybe a bit thinner in areas, and really building up these lights. A lot of color in the sky. You look at the sky and you think, well, it's just a light blue, but he might have started with a light blue everywhere, but he added some reds, some oranges, yellow greens, green, and there's a lot of color in the sky. There's a nice color variation also in the trees here. And there's a busyness in that there's a lot of sky holes, but it still reads real well. The foliage of all the trees really hold together, even though there's a lot of sky holes that break it up too much, or a lot, not too much. But they still hold together as a dark mass against a lighter sky. You can add more details as long as you don't break up your big shapes with too many value changes. But nice color variation in the foreground and the water. It's a nice painting. Some of it is dry brush. Again, wet paint on dry paint. So a nice one too. A lot of these thicker lights are on top of the little bit drier, darker paint. So the brush strokes stand out. So a lot of dry brush work on this. The foliage here is wet paint on dry paint. Just gives you a different paint quality look. And you don't have to have real sharp edges all the time just because you're painting wet paint on dry paint. You can get very sharp edges, but you can use a dry brush where you just pull that wet paint along and it kind of skips along and creates more of a broken look and softens the edge a little bit. Artist's name is William Forsythe. It's a lot of his work online. Interesting guy. It's an interesting group of painters, the Hoosier Group. Really worth studying.